Forget everything you think you know about the ancient past. We are taught that 5,000 years ago, humanity was primitive, struggling to survive with stone tools and fire. But what if the truth is actually terrifyingly different? Imagine a world where the atmosphere itself was different, creating a greenhouse of monsters. A world where genetic engineering wasn't a concept of the future, but a nightmare of the past. A world ruled not by kings, but by entities that demanded blood, taught forbidden technologies, and twisted the very DNA of life on Earth. This wasn't a time of cavemen. It was an era of advanced metallurgy, occult science, and a civilization so corrupt that the planet itself had to be rebooted. This is the true story of what life was really like before the Great Flood, approximately 5,000 to 4,400 years ago. Before the Great Flood, the planet Earth functioned according to laws completely different from those we know today. However, this abundant and massive vegetation hid a reality of true torment. While plants grew incessantly, animals of giant sizes wandered between the forests and human habitations. But creatures that were not completely human exercised absolute power, collecting taxes that no one wanted, or could afford, to pay. To survive in that antediluvian period meant walking alongside predators of enormous size, witnessing the sudden emergence of forbidden technologies, and enduring the terror of what actually happened when the children of God decided to come to Earth. The final state of the world makes it clear why complete destruction became the only option. Leaving home in that era meant stepping into an environment that was not intended for human measurements. Imagine walking along paths between trees so high that their crowns disappeared into the distant fog. Ferns reached 15 meters in height, forming green shelves that prevented the direct penetration of sunlight. On the skin, one felt more than just ordinary warmth. There was a soft, constant lighting coming from above, as if the sky was always shrouded in a veil. Some researchers indicate that, according to ancient documents, the planet was covered with a massive layer of steam. This vapor canopy completely enveloped the Earth, functioning as a natural greenhouse that retained heat, maintained constant humidity, and prevented storms or sudden changes in temperature. People walked among tree trunks of such large diameter that 20 people holding hands could not grab around them. Some of these trunks were hollow and served as natural homes for entire families. Even gathering fruit demanded almost military preparation. It required ropes, organized groups, and hours of climbing. However, the plants represented the smallest of dangers. The real danger was foreshadowed by vibrations in the earth. A man might stop, look around, and see a herd approaching. In the 40th chapter of the book of Job, we find a description of a creature known as Behemoth. This description corresponds accurately to enormous sauropods. These giant animals fed on the abundant vegetation. Their excrement formed smoldering heaps, serving as natural fertilizer, but the smell was unbearable, and no one dared to approach them. And they were not the only ones. Winged reptiles and colossal birds of prey flew over the villages, fishing in rivers and sometimes carrying away unsuspecting children. For this reason, roofs were fortified, walls were erected, and no one walked alone at sunset. The divine order given to humanity was unambiguous: rule over the animals. But how does one dominate something that weighs 20 tons? Only the most dexterous and attentive survived. The slow or careless were quickly destroyed by the inexorable force of nature. To exist in this world meant conducting a daily, constant, and secretive struggle. However, unsurprisingly, giant animals did not represent the greatest threat. The real horror began when people looked up and saw lights falling from the sky. These were not meteors or lightning. These were accurate, purposeful movements directed straight toward human settlements. They did not show up unnoticed. These observers, as they are called in texts such as the Book of Enoch, appeared in public places, entering the cities as if they were the owners. The most striking thing immediately was their height. They were 2.5 meters, perhaps 3 meters tall, much taller than any man of that time. But their height was secondary compared to their appearance. Their skin radiated a barely perceptible glow, like heated metal reflecting light. Their eyes sparkled in the dark. They owned all languages, knew personal names, family secrets that were never revealed, and histories long forgotten. They came offering gifts that were impossible to refuse, seeds that germinated twice as fast as usual, processing methods for unknown metals, knowledge about constellations, medicinal plants, and the paths of the planets. The Book of Enoch records the names of these leaders and the regions to whom each taught their secrets. Azazel discovered the art of war, introducing swords and shields. Chemistry and witchcraft were transmitted. Barakiel taught astrology. It was a fast track to knowledge that naturally would have required many generations to achieve. Everything was handed over immediately, but obviously, there was a price to pay. And it wasn't gold. They demanded women. Chapter 6 of the Book of Genesis describes this directly and frankly. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive and chose for themselves those whom they desired. It wasn't a polite request, but a violent assignment. Families watched, powerless to react, as their daughters were taken away by these heavenly entities. When these unions happened, women's biology underwent profound changes. They got pregnant, but what developed inside them was unusual. These were babies who were born about a meter long and with an insatiable appetite. Midwives understood immediately during childbirth that this was not an ordinary human child. The children born from these forbidden unions were not just a genetic variation, but the pattern of a new line. Mothers experienced severe pain and aggressive movements in the womb. Many did not survive childbirth. Apocryphal texts tell of the birth of characters of that era as something extraordinary, babies who, immediately after birth, opened their eyes and illuminated everything around them. But in the case of the Nephilim, what seemed like a miracle was truly terrifying. Their development was frighteningly accelerated. At 6 months old, they were already walking. At 2 years old, they had the strength of a fully formed adult. They unintentionally broke furniture, knocked down doors, and injured other children during games, not because of deliberate cruelty yet, but because of an inability to control their own strength. At 5 years old, they were already the size of an average adult. At 10 years old, their height exceeded 3 meters, and at adult age, they reached 4 meters. Some ancient legends mention even taller giants, perhaps with some poetic exaggeration, but the main idea remains the same: these were beings of titanic strength. They could uproot young trees like matches. They lifted stones that 10 men could not move. They hunted ferocious animals with their naked hands. However, the most worrying aspect was not their physique, but their minds. They learned quickly, started speaking early, and understood complex ideas, but they lacked compassion. The Book of Enoch says that they devoured the fruits of man's labor, exhausted all food supplies, then the herds, and then the game available in nature. These creatures had a genetically inherited psychopathic nature. They understood emotions intellectually but were unable to truly feel them. They viewed people as simple tools, like a herd, never like equals. Why obey a moral father whom they could easily destroy with one hand? By age 10, some of them had already taken lives, acting under the influence of impulse, sudden rage, or simply painful curiosity. Having reached adulthood, these hybrids decided they did not want to remain subordinate. Their goal was to reign as absolute rulers. Imagine a leader 4 meters tall, endowed with immeasurable strength and an appetite exceeding that of hundreds of ordinary people. There were no police capable of providing protection, nor a judicial system to contact. His will was the only current rule. Anyone who dared to challenge him simply disappeared. In the Book of Genesis, these hybrid creatures are described as people of great glory. In the original Hebrew, they are called Anshei Hashem, men of renown. They represented the most revered figures of that era. They were considered legendary heroes, invincible warriors, and untouchable leaders. They built huge dwellings from rough stone in fertile regions, erected thick walls, and levied exorbitant taxes on grain, livestock, precious metals, and women. Gigantic monuments were erected in their honor. There were sanctuaries where they performed sacrifices, and the social structure was extremely tough and cruel. They were at the top of the hierarchy, while humans occupied the lowest position. However, there was an increasing practical difficulty: food. How do you feed an entire population of giants? The Book of Enoch tells of the gradually growing horror. First, they devoured the whole harvest. Then, domestic animals. When these resources were depleted, they turned their attention to the people themselves. Ancient Jewish sources report that they became addicted to human flesh and blood. Eating people was not practiced in secret, it became a ceremony open to the public. There were altars where sacrifices were offered before frightened crowds. Children grew up watching these scenes, internalizing the idea that human life has no value. Genesis uses the exact term Hamas to characterize the earth at that time, which means arbitrary violence and brutal oppression. Murders happen every day, bodies were thrown on the streets. Scripture states that every thought of the human heart was only evil continually. These weren't separate outbursts of anger, but a constant state of wickedness. Greek stories of the Titans devouring their own children were not just fantasy, they were painful memories of that period. Goliath, who appeared many centuries later at almost 3 meters high, was just a remnant, a weakened genetic reminder of the power that these creatures possessed in their heyday. Horror hovered in the air that everyone breathed. But the Nephilim were not solely to blame for the death of the world. Their ancestors, known as the Watchers, continued to transmit forbidden knowledge. Suddenly, ordinary people had access to weapons and magical practices, turning the planet into a supernatural battlefield. Humanity mastered techniques that, at a normal pace of development, should have been discovered only 1,000 years later. Imagine a society that, in one generation, jumped from the stone and would age directly to complex metallurgy. This was not slow evolution, it was an instant transfer of advanced knowledge. The Book of Enoch describes in detail who taught what. It says that Azazel, one of the main Watchers, taught people how to make swords, daggers, shields, and armor. Before this revelation, controversy was resolved by physical force or simple hunting tools. After Azazel, armed conflicts became systematic and effective. Blades that forever retained their sharpness and metal alloys that sparkled in the sun easily pierced the human body. The number of deaths sharply increased. However, Azazel did not limit himself to teaching methods of destruction. He also revealed the forms of attraction and seduction. The text mentions that he revealed secrets about the metals of the earth and methods of their processing, including bracelets and jewelry, the use of antimony, and the art of emphasizing the eyes with makeup. This may seem like a small thing today, but in those days, the effect was devastating. Vanity became a tool of manipulation. A fixation on outward beauty, enhanced by decorations and face painting, gave birth to a society obsessed with appearance. Women fought for the attention of fallen celestial beings, men strived for fame through ostentatious appearance. The process did not stop there. Another observer named Samjaza taught the basics of magic and spells, what today we would call pharmacology or witchcraft, involving substances that changed mental states and opened dangerous spiritual paths. Barakiel revealed the secrets of astrology, causing people to give up worship of the Creator for the benefit of the creation, directing their decisions by the stars. Chapter 4 of the Book of Genesis confirms this sudden cultural progress among the descendants of Cain. Tubal-Cain appears as a great master working with bronze and iron. Jubal invented complex musical instruments such as harps and flutes. But the music, which should have served for praise, turned into continuous noise. In the cities, the sounds never stopped. Holidays lasted for days with repeated rhythms that suppressed any reflection or moral conscience. This was comparable to giving a child a nuclear power plant. The technology was accessible, but the ethical responsibility for its use simply did not exist. They had city fortifications, deadly weapons, constant entertainment, and even genetic experiments. In many areas, they were more developed than our current civilization, but spiritually, they were empty. This technical superiority opened a deep schism between two groups inhabiting the same world. On the one hand, there were empires of stone and metal. On the other, a small remnant fought to preserve the original human essence in simple dwellings made of leather. Two versions of humanity coexisted, irreconcilable, like water and oil. On one hand, there was the civilization founded by Cain. The Bible says that he built the first city and named it Enoch. Imagine a great city before the flood, high walls made of rough stone to protect against colossal predators, fortified with gates of shining bronze thanks to the knowledge of the Watchers, and observation towers from which guards kept watch over the surrounding area. Inside, there was constant noise, the incessant knock of Cain's blacksmiths working with metal without interruption, melodies and wails echoing throughout the streets, trade movements, ritual prostitution, and the worship of giants. This was an environment of luxury, pleasure, and constant fear. Beyond these places, in mountainous areas and on the high plains, the descendants of Seth survived. Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, says that during the time of Enosh, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. They chose a completely different way. They didn't build fortresses. They lived in tents, leading a nomadic lifestyle in direct harmony with nature, independent of artificial means. They rejected the weapons of war and the occult practices of the cities. They didn't have armies, and they didn't have giants as monarchs. They had only the oral transmission, conveyed by Adam about Eden and the hope of future redemption. For many generations, geographical distance preserved the purity of the race bearing the divine promise, as long as this protection was not violated. In the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis, verses 1 and 2, the moment of rupture is described, and when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were wonderful. Many explanations emphasize the intervention of angels, but this story also has a deep human aspect. We are talking about the mixing of two genera. The pious descendants turned their attention to the cities founded by Cain. They watched the women whose eyes were emphasized by cosmetics, the technique revealed by Azazel. They contemplated the splendor, the musical instruments, and the ostentatious power. They left the peaks and descended to the plains. Sensual attraction prevailed over dedication. They exchanged the simple life in tents for the luxury of stone buildings. They united in marriage and mixed, and when the last boundary of isolation collapsed, the evil concentrated in the cities spread like a contagious disease. The flood was not unleashed just because some people were wicked. It happened because even those who were once righteous became corrupted. Humanity had become universally evil. But as moral standards deteriorated, something even more terrible was happening to the biology of the world. Imagine walking through the forest and meeting a creature that the human mind refuses to understand, a creature that doesn't fit into the natural order of things. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, an accurate and alarming expression is used: all flesh had perverted its way on the earth. In most readings, this is taken to relate only to human mistakes. However, the Hebrew word used is basar, flesh, which literally means all living matter. The term shakat indicates corruption, distortion, or the destruction of the original plan. Ancient documents not included in the Bible, such as the Book of Jasher, mentioned in the Book of Joshua, and the Book of Jubilees, are more straightforward. They describe the hybridization of seeds between different species, what we now call genetic engineering. The ancients believed this was a violation of the boundaries established at the creation of the world. Consider Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian mythology: centaurs, minotaurs, chimeras, sphinxes. Today we see in these images just artistic fantasy. But what if these were images based on real events? What if these mythological stories were distorted echoes of the collective traumas of an era in which genetic manipulation went out of control? God determined in the 1st chapter of Genesis that every creature must reproduce according to its kind. In the code of life, there was internal protection. When the Watchers and their offspring violated this restriction, the result was a spectacle of deviations, unstable creatures, predators that couldn't support the ecological balance, and animals constantly suffering, divided between conflicting natures. The nutritional balance in food chains collapsed because nothing took its rightful place. The planet turned into a huge laboratory without rules and ethical restrictions. This view completely changes the understanding of the flood. Many interpret it as an explosion of divine wrath, but from this point of view, it is more reminiscent of a radical treatment on a universal scale. The planet's genetic code was so infected, so deeply changed, that the only way to preserve the original biology was to remove the affected parts and start everything again. There were no pure elements left in nature, only ubiquitous infection, while the natural world was collapsing in the forests and fields. In the fortified cities, humanity plunged into savagery, against the background of which any modern horror story would seem like a children's fairy tale. The only valid rule there was brute force. To stumble in the market of that era was not just an accident, it could mean execution without trial. In the sacred scriptures, a terrifying saying of Lamech, a descendant of Cain, is preserved. This is the first documented poem of humanity, and its theme is murder. He declares to his 2 wives, "I killed a man for wounding me, and a young man for harming me." Note the excess. Someone injured him, perhaps in a quarrel, perhaps unintentionally. The revenge was death. A young man pushed him, and he killed him. There was no proportionality. This was a life taken in exchange for a scratch. Lamech boasted about this: if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. He installed rules of endless revenge. There were no courts, authorities, or law enforcement organs. There were only armed gangs and powerful giants. If someone insulted an influential or rich person such as Lamech, he died. And if his relatives protested, they too were exterminated. The corpses remained on the streets until they decomposed or served as food for the mutated creatures. Compassion disappeared. The book of Genesis says that the land was filled with violence. Women were collected as objects for demonstration. Lamech was a pioneer in the destruction of the model of 1 husband and 1 wife, taking 2 for himself. Humans became goods. The book of Genesis gives the final diagnosis: every thought of his heart was only evil at all times. Try to imagine it. There were no spontaneous moments of relief, no manifestations of kindness. The mind of society functioned in a constant state of evil. It was a civilization with psychopathic traits. While blood flowed through the canals of stone cities, people began to notice an anomaly in the skies. The protective shell that enveloped the planet began to collapse. For the first time in thousands of years, people felt the cold on their skin, caused not by fear, but by an unprecedented physical sensation. Nobody understood this phenomenon because they had never before experienced it. Remember that layer of steam which maintained a stable and soft climate around the planet? Suddenly, it began to collapse. For the first time in the history of humanity, people felt icy air touch their skin and saw their own breath turn into fog. Cold winds rose. People who had lived for centuries in an ideal tropical environment had never seen the vapor of their own breath. The 2nd chapter of Genesis clearly states that before this time, there was no rain. The hydrological cycle was different. Therefore, when dark, heavy clouds began to gather, blocking the soft diffused light, the horror was instantaneous. There was a powerful thunder, an unprecedented, furious noise unknown to anyone. Then, the first drop of rain fell. The book of Genesis describes this moment with amazing accuracy. On that very day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. It wasn't just a strong storm. Imagine the ground beneath your feet fiercely cracking. The sources of the great abyss indicates huge underground reservoirs under colossal pressure. The plates of the Earth's crust suddenly moved apart. Gigantic jets of hot water burst from the depths of the planet, and the sky fell in torrents. It was a simultaneous onslaught, water pouring from above, and water bubbling from below. At first, some people may have tried to catch and drink the falling water from above, considering it harmless or just a fleeting phenomenon. Others sought refuge in their impressive stone palaces, relying on the strength of structures erected by the watchers. However, the water level rose by a few meters in just a few minutes. The rivers instantly overflowed their banks. The cities located in the valleys were absorbed in the first hour. These impregnable fortifications, designed to repel external invaders, now simply kept the water inside, turning cities into deadly water prisons. In the midst of this scenario of complete chaos, a lonely wooden ship, a kind of rectangular structure built by an elderly man named Noah, who had been the object of ridicule for decades, began to float calmly. As the most developed, cruel, and genetically changed society of all time sank into the mud, the door was sealed, and the silence that followed was deafening. The greatest civilization that ever existed on the planet was destroyed so completely that we now consider it just a legend, but it left us a clear warning. The floodwaters eventually receded, but the question remains, did we learn the lesson? The ancient world was destroyed not because it was primitive, but because it had lost its humanity in the pursuit of power and forbidden knowledge. Today, as we stand on the brink of new genetic frontiers and technological singularities, are we looking at progress, or are we just repeating the cycle of the antediluvian age? If you want to know how that lonely ark actually worked and the engineering behind the survival of the species, make sure to check out the next video on the screen. And I want to hear from you. Do you believe mythological creatures like centaurs and minotaurs were actually genetic experiments from this lost era? Type genetics in the comments below if you think history is stranger than fiction. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the truth about our past. See you in the next one.